So, this is the last of our four sessions on the horizons of or the Agile certification. Today we're going to be talking about the last or the most detailed of the horizons, the delivery horizon, which is where we actually produce and deliver our product. Before we go into that, I wanted to recap what we talked about over the last three sessions. The initial session was really talking a lot about the overall perspective of doing business analysis in an agile environment. Um, my personal opinion on this is that, and I think this is supported by all of the work that I've seen done in the agile environment, is that doing agile business analysis is not really substantively or technically different from doing analysis in any other circumstance. The differences come down to the idea of when you have to execute specific techniques and to what level of detail or what focus you're applying when you execute those techniques, so that you might have a general technique like brainstorming. Everybody does brainstorming under all sorts of different circumstances. In the agile environment, you would want to look at this and specifically target it and say, okay, at this point in time, we're doing brainstorming to try to develop an organizational strategy. So we focus our efforts particularly on the information that we need in order to define the organization's strategy, and we don't delve further into specific tactics to achieve that strategy or specific deliverables attached um, to being able to achieve that strategy. That really is the crux of, in my mind, how agile development and agile processes should work, in that you focus on exactly what do you need to know at this particular point in time in order to move the entire project or the process forward, and you don't spend a lot of time, doing work that is not immediately valuable. Um, there are, obviously there are some techniques that will only apply at specific points in time, but in general, certainly the principles that we've seen, the seven principles that are put forth for agile delivery, apply at across the board. It's just that at each level of successive detail, there's a slightly different focus for those principles, but they all do apply. The IIBA has adopted a paradigm that indicates basically three different horizons that they segment things into: a strategy horizon, which is intended to focus on the high level business objectives and goals for the organization; an initiative horizon, which is starting to delving into um, the tactical things that need to be done in order to be able to achieve the business strategy. This is where specific projects are taken on, um, initiatives being defined as either programs, projects, or activities. But at the initiative horizon, we're talking about specifics. We're starting to get into specific product deliverables, and this is the horizon where we talk about developing roadmaps for products. So sequencing delivery, because the agile paradigm um, basically defines delivery as a somewhat continuous process, so that we're not delivering a product intact. We're delivering pieces of a product, over a timeline, and we're basically putting together the product over a timeline. The one caveat to that is that there are some times when there will be initiatives that are small enough that they can be delivered relatively rapidly. They are specific, but it might be your one iteration project. Um, But at the initiative level, we're talking about defining the iterations, defining the content of the iterations, defining the sequence of the iterations, and so we're breaking a bigger product into smaller chunks and determining how those chunks are going to be delivered. And then the delivery horizon is where we take a specific chunk of that work and we say, okay, this is these are the pieces that we're putting together at this particular point in time, and that's what we need to focus on. Obviously, the level of detail at each of those horizons is somewhat different. There's a different focus, and one of the keys to the whole process is that the information that's obtained or put together at any of the horizons informs each of the other horizons so that these are not silos. These are it's a continuous loop of where strategy informs initiatives inform delivery, the output from delivery informs initiatives, and the output from initiatives informs strategy. And you could also have the last connection, which is the output from delivery could also inform strategy, so that it's a constant, basically a loop of feedback through the whole process. That is one of the things that makes the process work. Um, it's also that there is a closer connection between the business resources and the delivery or development resources, in that there needs to be close communication and connection across those boundaries. That can be something that organizations have difficulties with. It involves a cultural change in the organization, which really does need to be adopted across the entire organization. It's really almost impossible to have an agile delivery side of the house, an agile IT side of the house, unless you have an agile business side of the house, because the IT people can't really function the way they're supposed to without having close contact with the business people. One of the things that Itoma and I were talking about um, just a little while ago was the concept of having BAs who are talking to developers and working with developers, and the developers are expecting the BAs to be able to answer questions for them, and sometimes that's not the let's say that it's just not an optimal circumstance. The BAs don't necessarily have the information that the developers need, and this is this sort of transition state where optimally you would have business resources available to communicate directly with your development team, and you would still have your business analysis function sort of facilitating that, being in the middle of that, but not really being responsible for the direct transfer of information, but more being responsible for facilitating the transfer of information. Um, that is what's really going to make agile work, but it does require that the business organization understands that they have to provide resources and be hands-on available for the development, the delivery team. So We talked specifically about the two of the horizons, the strategy horizon, which was where we were looking at establishing business goals and objectives. I said that my experience certainly has been that the BA function, uh, when we're talking about actual BAs, the BA function frequently does not get involved at that level, which I think is unfortunate and doesn't really support that idea very well. I think that you have to do business analysis, and you can't say, well, we're doing business analysis at a strategic level, so the people that need to be doing it are the higher level executives in the organization. They're responsible for the strategy. That argues to an organization that doesn't necessarily understand what business analysis is really about. The kinds of things that a well-crafted BA function can bring to the table in terms of dealing with strategy are just as valuable as what the BAs can bring to the table on the delivery horizon working with developers. Uh, so I think that that was one of the key things for me, and one of the things that I like kind of the most about this whole agile paradigm that certainly the IIBA is putting forth is stressing the value of good solid business analysis at the strategic level so that you have good business goals, well-defined business goals. Um, you understand that in order to be able to achieve business goals, you have to have solid ways of determining whether or not you're achieving those goals, so that you have to establish criteria and measurement um, at the strategic level as well as at the lower levels. And that's again an area where I think that there is a lot to be learned in the world for organizations. Basically, understanding that goals are goals, and we need to be establishing goals with the idea of improving the business, not with the idea of rewarding or punishing the people who establish the goals. So, moving down to the initiative horizon, we kind of looked at this as the point in time where we start to we have products that are defined specific. The intention to deliver specific products, and our goal at the initiative horizon is to basically decompose those products into component parts, so that we can assess the component parts in terms of the value that they will deliver to our customers, our users, and we will be able to then sequence those. Sequence those components into a logical roadmap for the delivery of a product, emphasizing the fact that we are looking at providing value to the customers as consistently and as rapidly as possible. Um, that does not mitigate the idea that there are certain components, certain aspects of products which are basically foundational aspects that need to be delivered, even though they won't necessarily deliver direct value to the customer. They will deliver the capability to achieve value as additional components are put in place. Those are the kinds of decisions that are made at the initiative level. This is where product roadmaps are put together so that we have a listing of the things that we're working on currently, the things that we're going to be working on in the near term future, and the things that are longer term deliverables. Um, we're not going down into the level of detail of building the actual components. We're just defining what those components are supposed to be and gathering information about those components to basically determine the value that will be added by those components. Um, that basically leads us to where we are today, which is the delivery horizon. So before we jump well, with both feet into the delivery horizon, is there anything that we've talked about in the last couple of sessions that you feel is unclear or you feel like you'd like to have a little bit more time spent on? Nope.
No, from my side.
Okay. Good. Good. Okay, then let's jump into the delivery horizon. The delivery horizon is where we actually start to put together the pieces that are going to be put out to our clients, our customers for their use. Um, it's the most detailed level of the whole paradigm. It's an area where there's where probably BAs are most focused in their classic careers. It's really uh, sort of a bit about requirements engineering, about managing requirements, about basically making sure that you have the appropriate level of detail for your requirements, so that the development team, the actual people who are writing and testing the products, have a very clear understanding of what they're supposed to be doing and can work on how they're going to do it. At at this particular point in the process, it's very important that everyone up and down the project team has a clear understanding of what is trying to be done, so that you can establish criteria for it being done that will actually meet the business needs. So the business people need to understand the needs that they're trying to address. They need to be very clear about how those needs are going to be addressed in terms of functionality, and that will allow the delivery team to focus on the actual implementation of those things with a very clear understanding of the goals. The work at the delivery horizon is based on the product backlog. Uh, in general, what happens is that a certain number of items will be selected by the delivery team for delivery in a current iteration. Iteration at this point being a smaller a time box where a certain amount of delivery time and delivery resources are dedicated to actually building and testing the product. The pieces of that product that come out are are based on the backlog, which is informed by the roadmap, so that we've got the project broken down into its component parts, and we choose the ones that are going to achieve us a chunk of value for the customers, and say we're going to deliver these things uh, in our next delivery. So although this bullet point says identify and prioritize the backlog, the overall backlog for the product should be identified and prioritized at the initiative level. There still is there's a backlog of work that needs to be done that's selected in order to be accomplished in the specific iteration that we're working on. And that work also needs to be identified, broken down, and prioritized, so that we get into actually delivery tasks and say, okay, well, in order to build this piece, there are a sequence of tasks that we need to go through, and that's how our iteration is prioritized and dealt with. And one of the things that's key at this point is because the solutions are going to be evaluated, we need to know what they're being evaluated against. We need to know how the users are going to be able to verify that they've actually gotten what they signed up for. Um, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Okay, continuing in what is attempting to be accomplished at this horizon. This is where we're doing specific work, but we need to be sure that that specific work is mapped back to our overall business goals. Um, we need to be able to break down the work into small enough chunks that the delivery team can actually uh, process those chunks effectively and efficiently. The kinds of numbers that I've seen, in my experience is that it should be things should be broken down into tasks that are intended to take no longer than a day to complete. Ideally, there would be a couple of hours, half a day or so, but half a day to a day is the general guidance for the level of detail that things should be broken down to. That includes both components and tasks. So that if you have a component and your delivery team says, "Wow, it's going to take us 2 weeks to build this component," we need to be able to break that down into tasks so that there is a consistent measure of progress over the course of an iteration. If you say you're going to do an iteration of 2 weeks, and if based on most of the agile paradigms you're going to be reviewing what you've done every day, you really need to have some sort of solid way of determining that you've got you've accomplished your tasks. That's a little bit idealistic, but it certainly should be the goal. You know, one of the classic things about development, and this was certainly more true in the waterfall environment, was uh, you always had to be moving forward. So you had a task that you knew was going to take, several weeks to do, and every week somebody would ask you, well, what percent are you complete? And you would say, okay, well, let's see, last week I was 10% complete, so this week I must be 15% complete, or gee, this is due next week, so I must be at least 75% complete. And you would just kind of pick a number out of thin air without much without much real thought about exactly what does this number mean. And usually, what happens is that you would get to the very end of your time window for completion. You would get to your deadline, and you would look back at the history and you would say, well, gee, we've been 90% complete for the last 4 weeks. You know, so we're not done, so we're not 100% done. So, and we got to 90% 2 weeks ago, and now we're stuck. How do we indicate to people that we're moving forward, we're continuing to work, but we're not really accomplishing anything. We're still at 90%. Uh, this is not, this doesn't work in the agile world. In the agile world, it's about actually producing something and not producing a percentage complete. It's kind of a binary thing. Either you're done or you're not done. If you're not done, then there's a reason why you're not done, and if you're done, you move on to the next thing. It is also the case that at the delivery horizon, you can identify additional things that need to be done, additional specific tasks, not necessarily additional components, but perhaps modifications to components. All of those kinds of things should inform your process so that they can be added to your overall backlog. You may find, at this this particular point, you may find specific defects that need to be addressed. And if you find specific defects that need to be addressed, they can either be addressed as a part of the current iteration, or it can be, oh, this is something that we're not going to be able to do at this point in time. We understand that it needs to be done, so we put it into the backlog for another iteration. It becomes a basically a fluid process that uh, takes you through. Have either of you guys seen this picture that's sitting on the right hand side of the screen? It's another one of the kind of bits of BA humor that have been around for quite a while.
My
And
manager actually uses that all the time as an example.
yeah, yeah, it's kind of a fun, a little fun thing that somebody put out there a long time ago, and in a lot of ways it makes sense because it points out that people have different perspectives, and if you don't all understand each other's perspectives, you get something that looks like this. And so this is key to indicating that we really should have a shared understanding of what we're trying to do so that we're all working from the, oops, I hit what I was going to try and point to something on here, and I was going to point to this guy over here as what we all should be thinking, or what we all should agree on, and yet we've got all of these other aspects that different people have. So, okay.
Hello, Tom.
Hello.
So based on the last diagram, can you go back?
Sure. This guy? Yep.
So how the project was documented, that's nothing, right?
Yep.
What
Exactly.
what is the yeah. So what is the basic how is this tying together? Saying okay, nothing was documented. So what was being explained and how was it being explained if there were this was not being documented?
Well, it's just saying that, if you follow this through, it's saying, well, this is what the customers said that they wanted,
Explained. Hmm.
you know. This is what the project manager heard when from the explanation. This is what the analyst designed, and this is what the
Is it like
programmer
the
worked.
project manager?
And the
Is it
problem
like the
is,
project manager? Sorry, Tom.
sorry, you were saying something?
Yeah, I said, is it like the project manager had to explain to the BA what the business wanted?
No, it's just that, and one of the keys here from the analysis perspective is that since nothing was documented, it was all based on conversations that people had,
Conversation.
and and people hear things and understand things differently. And that's the whole point of this, is that each one of these people has a different perspective, and the key here is because nothing was documented, there was no central point that everyone could go to say,
Reference.
this is what information was communicated. Do we all
Mm-hmm,
agree that this is the information that was communicated? Um,
mm-hmm,
you know, you have this problem, and that everybody has their own perspective, everybody has their own understanding. There's no central point that anybody can get to, so they all kind of went off and did their own thing.
mm.
They kind of said, okay, well, this is what I thought, and that that doesn't work. That results in a mess. Um, and
Can
this
you explain the second point again? Slice and elaborate upon user stories.
slice and
What's this
elaborate
point
user
really
story.
saying? Yeah. Huh?
This is because at this level, you need to be defining specific things that need to be done, and you need to be sure that everybody understands exactly what needs to be done, and even more to the point, understands how that work is going to be verified and validated, so that
Okay.
You need to be sure that for your user stories, they're at the right level of detail, so that they can be achieved in small chunks. Sorry. And you need to know that you have this is where you need to have the appropriate level of detail to actually accomplish the work. In theory, you should be gathering information. You don't want to gather your information on your user stories en masse higher up, because then you're basically doing waterfall using user stories instead of waterfall using requirements. You want to say, okay, when I need to know exactly what I need to do and how it's going to be verified and validated is when I start to work on this. So,
So does it mean, because if you look at the way the Babak talks about user stories, it only mention user stories as a technique
yep.
used by some other task. Does it mean the Babak is mainly focused on waterfall approach to
No.
waterfall? No,
No, because the Babok doesn't
because
say,
it doesn't mention what user stories as a requirement.
but it doesn't prescribe that user stories are done at a specific point in time. It says for an effective user story, you have to have it has to be the appropriate size. It has to meet all of the criteria for an effective user story. But that detail, all of the detail that comprises that acceptance
Yeah.
criteria, doesn't need to be in place until the delivery team says we're going to work on this user story. So you
Mm.
can start writing user stories. You can be writing user stories from day one, and you just those user stories go into the backlog. They continue to be added to the backlog as they're developed, as they're exposed. But the key is that you don't have to have all of the necessary elements for a complete and correct user story until you're going to work on that user story.
Okay.
Okay, and that's what they're focusing on here. Here is at the delivery horizon is where you need to ensure that your user stories are broken down um, to sufficiently small chunks that the delivery team can handle them, and that each chunk has all of the necessary information to allow the delivery team to develop and deliver that piece. Okay.
Mm. Okay.
Yep. That's actually part and parcel of this whole idea of agile delivery being broken down into strategic and initiative and delivery, so that you may have uh, the same initial information, but as you proceed further on down towards the point in time where you're going to deliver it, you develop more detail about it. So it becomes progressive. You start with an epic, you break an epic down into user stories, you determine whether your user stories are broken down to a sufficient level of detail, then you break the user story down into the tasks, the specific tasks that need to be done in order to deliver it. But it
So
all
Tom, I have
starts
a
from
question. Like,
sure. Yep.
so so let's say there's a regulatory requirement, right, where the business stakeholders or stakeholders have specified what they expect to be delivered or to be an application or interface to be compliant to. So they have specified um, like in small requirements, like maybe you can have up to 100 of such specific lines which speak to distinct objectives meant to be achieved by a user interface or an application that is meant to 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 comply to a regulatory standard. So
Okay.
for this kind of requirement, does it mean in when you are approaching this from an HR point of view, you have to create each of those requirement slices as a specific user story?
Oh, you can. You don't necessarily have to.
Because
Um,
if one has to do that, you probably have to have 100 user stories speaking to distinct requirements meant to be
Yeah.
delivered by the application.
Yeah.
I don't know what from your experience, what would you do?
I would look at them and say, okay, can some of these, because yeah, I would look at them from the perspective of, can any of these be grouped together so that we can look at we can look at a piece of functionality and break it down into its component parts and then say, okay, does this mean that we need to be doing things differently, or is this basically a set of criteria that could be combined into a function? They would kind of be more on the level, I want to say, of acceptance criteria. So I'm thinking in terms of doing something like defining a user interface. Defining screens in a user interface, you would say, okay, I want to work on a screen, and you would combine all of the constraints for that screen into one chunk and say, okay, well, in order to determine whether or not this screen was successful, these are all of the things that it needs. These are all the specific things that it needs to be able to do. Um,
So
you know,
basically creating super categories out of this.
yeah, yeah. I would look to say, can these things be combined? I mean, there's such a thing as slicing and dicing things too finely too. Um, you know, if you spend an inordinate amount of time breaking things down into really little isolated things, you're also going to run into problems. One of the funny things that I did at one point in time was I was doing some requirement stuff, and this was a educational exercise actually, and I was writing use cases. And then I looked at it and said, gee, I wonder if, these use cases, because the paradigm that the consulting firm that I work with is that use cases can generally be broken down or transformed directly into requirement statements. That's the way they like to write use case steps, such that it's very easy. And I did this and put it all together, and then I said, gee, I wonder if we're thinking about doing this in an agile environment. Maybe I should do these as user stories. And I looked at it and I said, I can make this, because the paradigm for a step in a use case and a user story is relatively close, which is to say that you have a statement that says there's an actor performs an action, the action uses some information and it transforms that information somehow. So it's the statement is somebody does something with some information under certain circumstances to achieve a certain goal. Translates really easily into, as an actor, I want to do this with this information so that I can achieve a value. So I was able to take an entire, a use case that had 15 or 20 different steps and break it down into 15 or 20 different user stories. You know, I'm not sure whether that makes total sense. I would argue that it probably doesn't make sense, but in terms of the paradigm, it's like, okay, I have a use case, which is an activity that somebody has to achieve, which translates sort of to an epic, and the use case translates down into requirement statement steps, where the epic breaks down into user stories, and then you just have to determine whether the appropriate level of granularity is there. But it's a process, and you really need to look at it as you can build, you can basically build bigger chunks from smaller chunks, or you can build smaller chunks from bigger chunks, and you need to be able to work in both directions and basically get yourself to the point where your delivery team is comfortable that the chunks that you give them are the right size for them to work with. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Yep. So, um, refined backlog. This is what I said here, where we're starting to say, we need to be doing these things just in time. We need to look at a piece that we want to work on and say, this is the piece I want to work on. I need to be sure that I have the appropriate level of detail at the appropriate time to work on this piece. Um, you know, as you go through, obviously, as you're working in the delivery horizon, you're delivering pieces of work, and you're not necessarily delivering pieces of completed work. The goal would be that there is close enough communication between the business stakeholders and your delivery team that they're basically working side by side so that the delivery person can say, okay, take a look at this piece. It may just be a single function. It may just be a single element on a screen, but the idea would be to say to my ultimate users, my stakeholders, uh, does this work for you? Is this the right direction? So you're kind of constantly delivering prototype kinds of things to your users to look at. And again, you've got this. It's a balancing act. Uh, if you don't happen to have business resources who are dedicated 100% of the time, um, then you may not be able to do. This is almost like extreme programming. If you're familiar with extreme programming, it's a pair programming technique where two developers work on the same thing at the same time, so that one can be working on it and the other can be watching what's going on and commenting and assisting with that, or reviewing what the one developer has done to ensure that it's done correctly. If you extend that paradigm out to pairing a business user with a developer, then you have the situation where the developer could be constantly writing code and saying to the business user, "Okay, is this right? Is this what you mean? Is this what you need? Is this what you want?" This is the feedback that you want to get at the delivery horizon as much as possible and as rapidly as possible, so that you don't go down any bad paths, so that the mistakes or the potential mistakes are mitigated as rapidly as possible. And you can see from the diagram on the right hand side of the screen, you have this stack. Let me see if yeah, you have this stack that sits over here on the right, on the left-hand side of the picture on the right, which is your overall product backlog. And then when you're going into an iteration, a time box sprint, you select certain items from this stack and you put them into the sprint. So you have your sprint backlog, and then from the sprint backlog, you break down each of those items into its component tasks, and that puts together your plan for your for your sprint time box. Okay. User stories. Okay. User stories are a key to the whole agile paradigm. They're relatively straightforward in terms of putting together. It's as an actor, whoever the actor is, I want to do something. What do I want to do? Why do I want to do it? That's the simple statement of a user story. And that's just a starting point for all of the conversation that we need to have around this simple action is, um, we're going to need further details that say under what circumstances, under what sorts of constraints am I operating, What kinds of things apply to this particular action, and how will I verify that this particular action was successful? Um, the invest criteria, I'm going to drop off and jump into this guy. Yep, I did do it right. The invest criteria. Okay. Um, an acronym that is very useful in terms of user stories. It is independent. So we want to make sure that our user stories can stand alone on their own 2 feet. That they're they may be related to other user stories, but each individual user story can be delivered as a piece of functionality. Okay? Independent. Negotiable. Basically, when we're putting together a user story, we're talking about an action that needs to be accomplished. We're not necessarily talking about how that action is going to be accomplished. It's the user story itself is more about the what than the how. The how is something that needs to be negotiated between the delivery team and the business users. Obviously, the delivery team is going to have ideas about the specific implementation. They may have specific technical constraints that they need to deal with, and those things are basically the things that need to be talked about between the business users and the delivery team, so that they negotiate. Uh, the functionality that's going to be delivered by this user story. Valuable, obviously, we need to be accomplishing things, and we've talked about value for forever. It's an underlying principle of all of what business analysis is about, or should be about at this particular point in time. So we want to be sure that our user stories are actually going to achieve value for the users. Estimable, in order to be able to determine whether or not we can deliver something. Because we're working in time-bounded chunks, we need to be able to have some sort of idea of the amount of time that it's going to take to deliver this functionality. Ideally, we're looking to be able to establish user stories in chunks that can be delivered in a single iteration. If a user story appears that it can't be delivered in a single iteration, if the delivery team talks about it and says there's just too much here, then perhaps the user story is at a little bit too high a level, needs to be broken down. A little bit further, again, this is part of the negotiation. It's up for grabs. It depends on how the team works and you know, how they manage themselves. Sized appropriately, there you go. Able to complete in a single iteration, and the smaller the better. And that just allows us to build chunks that we can continue to verify and basically check off the lists and say, this is done. My caveat here, although it says the smaller the better, I think that it's the smaller the better within the context of if it gets too small, it's going to be a problem. Testable can be validated objectively by a stakeholder, and this is included as a part of the detail of the user story. Is how is this functionality going to be validated by its stakeholders, and so that needs to be a part of your user story. Okay, go back to here. So it meets the invest criteria. It has a well-constructed narrative. It's understandable to people. It's clear. Um, you know, it's it just basically is we negotiate out any ambiguity in the story. If the delivery team doesn't understand something about it, then that needs to be hammered out ideally, certainly before the user team agrees to work on or before the delivery team agrees to work on the story, so that they have a clear picture, so that they don't get started on it and then say all of a sudden, oh, we don't understand this. Now, that's again, best of all possible worlds, ideal. This is why you should have a good, solid business analyst or a business analysis function included as a part of your delivery team, so that when the people who are working on developing the actual code or testing the actual code have a question, they have a source that they can go to talk to about this. Not necessarily going back to the business people, but you know, potentially also going back to the business people. And and the other key on this, although it's not included as a part of the actual user story specification here, is the clear, concise, and precise acceptance criteria, which is the reverse side of the user story card. It's the information that is going to allow the testers, the, the testing people, and certainly the user testing people to determine whether or not this user story has been fulfilled. Okay. A user story, the team, the overall team needs to agree that this is a piece of the product that they're going to work on in this particular iteration. It needs to be something that we believe can be delivered successfully in this iteration, going back to the appropriate sizing of the user stories. You don't want to have user stories that are going to have to span multiple iterations in order to get completely done. They should be broken down into smaller pieces. And we need to have a clear picture of where this sits in the level of value in the product backlog, so that we can make a valid choice as to whether or not to work on this. I've mentioned this already. We've kind of beaten this almost to death, that a user story needs to be ready for implementation when it's going to be worked on. If you do, obviously, as you're doing elicitation of information, you should be constantly adding information if you have that information. You shouldn't be ignoring the information, but at the same time, you shouldn't be focusing on drilling into the information until it's actually needed for delivery. That would be a key thing to look at, and it's a very easy place to get kind of dragged down into rabbit holes where you get interested in a discussion, or your business users get interested in a discussion, interested in talking about some functionality, because that happens to be the key focus for the day or the key focus for the week. And if it turns out that the delivery team is not actually going to be working on this, you can get dragged into collecting too much detail too early in the process. Um, the danger to that, obviously, is because we're assuming that we're working in an environment where things can change. Any information that you collect and gather and compile before you're going to be working on a specific project or a specific piece of the project is subject to change. So that's um, it's just something that you need to be aware of if you happen to be, and again, um, as most things, business analysis is, it depends. If you happen to have an environment or a specific initiative where the where the environment is not necessarily subject to rapid change, that doesn't mean you can't use an agile paradigm to develop against that. You could Anything that you could do in a waterfall paradigm, you could do in an agile paradigm. Um, you know, that's just I would argue that the reverse is not true. But anything that you could do in a waterfall paradigm, you could do in an agile paradigm. It's just that you would have the luxury of being able to say we can continue down getting detail as our stakeholder feel it's appropriate to deliver that detail, understanding that it's not going to change. That would be a luxury in an agile environment, to be able to say, you know what, we can continually get information about the requirements for our project, as the users want to give it to us, because we know that it's not going to change, or not going to change significantly, and we won't be wasting our time. So again, that comes down to, it's what works in your environment. If you have a more stable environment, then take advantage of that. If you have a more dynamic environment, then be careful about getting too much detail too early. Okay. Maintaining the backlog, this is the other thing that needs to be done at the delivery horizon, is that we're constantly looking at this backlog. We're constantly saying, do we have the right items in the backlog? Do we understand the value that's going to be created for our stakeholders by these items? And have we sequenced them properly? Um, and this is something that is subject to change. Even though you at the initiative level develop a product roadmap, that doesn't mean that the roadmap doesn't change or can't change based on changes in the environment, based on feedback that's coming from basically from your delivery horizon. As pieces of the project are being delivered, it may become obvious that other pieces of the project become more or less important, and part of the process here is making sure that your backlog always reflects um, that you're constantly looking at the priorities and determining that your priorities are still valid. For the BA in the delivery horizon, the BA is also supporting. You're supporting the delivery team. You're a member of the delivery team, but you're supporting the actual people who are doing the coding and testing work, so that you're there and available to deal with any questions that these people, that your team members bring to you about the work that they're working on. So similar in one way, similar to the position of the Scrum Master. The BA is basically tasked with getting rid of any impediments to the development or testing teams. Um, that's a little bit more hands-on than perhaps, and a little bit different focus than what the Scrum Master should be doing for the team, but it is that your part of your function there is to resolve problems. Okay. Sequencing and dependencies, again, as a BA, you're a resource. You need to be there and available to help, you know, to help the team be able to do what they need to do to successfully deliver the product. Okay. Ensuring learning happens in the agile context. Yeah, one of the things that we've said all along is that being able to develop in an agile environment is about taking advantage of information as it becomes available. Um, Understanding that we don't always know everything, and even in terms of our process, we don't always know exactly how things should be done, or we should be open to the idea that um, something that comes out of the work that we're doing right now should be able to be used to inform the next sequence of work that we have to do, or to help us modify what we're doing right now in order to be more efficient. So in this context, we're we're looking at as we do our delivery, we should be taking the time. This is retrospectives. We should be taking the time to say, okay, let's talk about what we did. Did we do it right? If we did it right, do we need to continue doing it? Did we do it wrong? Do we need to change it? It needs to be a fluid process, a flexible process. Caveat there would be that you also need to be mindful that changing a process is also going to be disruptive, or potentially disruptive, so that you really need to feel confident that it's worth making a change. If we all agree that there's something that we don't quite do right, but the effort to change the way we do that would be more disruptive than continuing to do this particular thing the way we've been doing it, then we can make a valid decision that says, we're not going to make a change here. We understand that there's an issue here, or there's a potential issue here, but we don't feel that it's worth the effort to change that. So that, you know, we have the right to make that decision. There should be time allotted in your process in order to do this. It should not be excessive amounts of time, because time spent doing this is time spent not doing other things, and so we need to balance the potential waste of time spent thrashing about things versus doing things. Um, at this particular point, uh, our feedback should be allowing us to look at the items that remain in our backlog, to understand whether we need to change or reprioritize any of the stories. And we're feeding back to the initiative horizon to say, to the initiative and strategy horizons to say, do we need to make changes at a higher level, um, in terms of, do we continue with this initiative at all? So that's all facilitated by collecting information, collecting feedback from the delivery horizon, and feeding it back to the appropriate other horizons. Maintain focus on the product vision, customer, and value. Well, this is the whole delivery paradigm is about delivering value, and so we need to ensure that everything that we're doing feeds into that idea of delivering value. Um, this is uh, basically continuing to make sure that information is traveling the way it needs to travel between the members of the team, and that we all are kind of marching to the same drummer, that we all have the same understanding of what we're trying to achieve, so that we're all focused on that same ultimate goal. Timeframes. The delivery horizon is the shortest of the three time frames. It's based on your organizational methodologies. Scrum tends to recommend a 2 week as an optimal sprint iteration timeline, with variations from 1 to 4 weeks. I have actually seen some circumstances where people wanted to go to 6 weeks. One interesting thing, and I have mixed feelings about that, is that most of the agile paradigms say that you should establish a consistent time frame for your iterations, that they should always be whatever number you choose and not variable. I can see pluses and minuses in that. If you're a good, experienced delivery team, if you have good people who understand how to do things and what needs to be done, then you probably will be more successful at this than if you're a fledgling team where you don't have necessarily a solid team velocity, where you're not necessarily fluent and really experienced at sizing stories, estimating stories. You may find that you're going to run yourselves into trouble in the early stages of your migration or your acceptance of the agile paradigm. You should allow yourself to be a little bit flexible with that, uh, saying that ultimately the goal is to get it to a consistent level, and that's good for the organization and good for the team to get that consistency, but it may be hard to achieve early on in the game. Also, the other thing to note, obviously, or should be obvious here, is that this paradigm operates at the team level. So you may find that you have a one agile team in your organization that is comfortable and happy with two week iterations. Their team just functions like a well-oiled machine on 2 week iterations. You may find that you have another team or a specific project where the team for that project says, you know what, for our purposes, it needs to be a little bit different. We can't operate on a 2 week paradigm. We need to be operating on a 4 week paradigm for our particular initiative. That's acceptable. That is, each team is its own entity. Each team has its own right to determine how it will function the best, and your organization will function best if your teams are allowed to do that. Um, Obviously, you may have some coordination things that are going to have to be worked out between your teams, but they need to have that flexibility to understand how to make their own process work for them. And obviously, the time frame on your delivery horizon is constantly shifting because you're always working on a different chunk. Every time you finish a chunk, you start another chunk, so you always have the same time frame, but it moves forward, it rolls forward as you go through iterations. Feedback and learning. Um, we've this is really repetitious of the earlier slides. We are going to be getting feedback. We want to be getting feedback from our stakeholders as frequently as possible, and we want to be implementing that feedback, responding to that feedback, and using it to inform decisions that we make, both at the delivery level and feeding back into the initiative and strategy horizons. Okay. One thing to note about retrospectives is that retrospectives can be a formal process or they can be an informal process or a combination of the two. Um, there's no magic to that. That again is what works for your team under the specific circumstances that you're talking about. That should always really be the case in an agile paradigm, that you should be able to communicate formally or informally. Uh, the goal is to make sure that that the information gets communicated at the appropriate time to the appropriate level of detail to the appropriate people, and that everyone understands. Um, that there are not pockets of information that are not being transmitted to other people. Sometimes adding a level of formality to the communication helps that. Again, it's a balancing act. Your team and your organization needs to develop that and deal with that so that you determine what level of formality is necessary in order to function efficiently. I think this is an area where organizations have, in general, uh, gone, the pendulum has swung more towards, or it's been more towards the formality side of things for a long time. I think Agile is bringing in more informality. It's, you know, again focusing on the interaction between the people who are involved, the direct interaction between the people who are involved, as opposed to using or establishing formal mechanisms for communicating information. So that's a balancing act. Okay, at this particular point in time, I'm going to suggest that we take a break. It's just about 48 minutes after the hour. I'm going to suggest that we go to the top of the hour, take a break till the top of the hour, and then pick up with Agile principles. Okay.